Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to be here and in a sense to have an introduction which takes us into the heart of what I want to talk about, which is what a funny country we are. I don't know whether you all realize the kind of event that we're having now is utterly unknown in most of Europe. The notion of voluntary activity, the notion that significant parts of healthcare, of education, of civic life are essentially the result of voluntary, not state-funded activity is peculiar to the Anglo-Saxon world. If you look in continental Europe, there is scarcely a trace of what we call charitable endeavour. So we are, what?
We've got it very well said.
But it is really true, and we need to understand this. We are a very peculiar country. And I am going to be, in the good and the bad senses of the word, funny peculiar and funny ha-ha. We're both. And what I want to do this evening, amongst friends and amongst people who are reasonably sophisticated and won't have a fit, if I say that I am not entirely appalled at the notion there may be a little bit of corruption in government. You know, this is nothing terribly surprising or unusual or even particularly shocking. And by the way, we owe a great deal to Robert Walpole, who pioneered it all. You know, that we can begin to talk as adults about what we are and why we are. The idea on which I've hung it is the notion of how England is governed, beginning with Henry VIII and finishing with King Boris. Because you do need to understand, we do have a monarch, and it's not the Queen. Or rather, we have two. A symbolic one, which is the Queen, and a real, rather fallible one, but then most monarchs were called Boris, and that Downing Street is a court, and that Carrie is an overambitious queen. I call her Cannie Boleyn. Much better than Carrie Antoinette, but the point is the same. So what I want to do is to take that trajectory of ideas and to explain them, to mock, but also to appreciate. Because absurd and preposterous though they are, they work. And they have delivered. A little bit like the notion that things as vital as St. John's Ambulance and whatever does remain voluntary and depend on people paying too much for rather good champagne and producing. Sorry, but think of it. It's very odd. It's unusual to us. Right, let's begin. All of you here will be familiar with the fact that we have a capital. You think it's called London. It's not. It's called Westminster. There are these twin cities in London, the twin cities of London and Westminster, which function more or less as though Washington and New York were separated by a mile, rather than what they are separated by. In other words, you have London, the City of London, as the commercial capital, the equivalent, much more than the equivalent of New York, and you have, at the same time, Westminster as the political and administrative capital, like DC. But Westminster itself is also a place of profound history. What I want to try to do with you is to explore how our government develops and shapes itself using the buildings of Westminster as a model to take us through. So to go through from the original Palace of Westminster, the origin of what we call, rather badly, the Houses of Parliament, through the Palace of Whitehall, through to the new Key Royal Palace, which is not that rather badly refurbished dump called Buckingham Palace. It is Downing Street, as you probably know. Many of you will have been in it. That little frontage onto Downing Street is deeply deceptive, because behind it opens out into a 60-room mansion overlooking Horse Guards with splendid and noble rooms. And it's a palace. It's a town palace. Right. Well, let's begin then with the origins of Westminster itself. Westminster is created by the founder myth of English history, who is Edward the Confessor. It is Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon, well, the last reigning Anglo-Saxon king, apart from the brief episode of Harold. He is the one who creates the Westminster, the West Church. He builds it as a noble Benedictine monastery, which from the beginning seems to have been intended as a coronation church. And every monarch from England from that point onwards has been crowned in Westminster Abbey. The abbey was also designed as a burial place. So it's both, as it were, it's the life cycle. This fact becomes clear when the abbey is rebuilt in the 13th century by Henry III in the magnificent form that we have now, the extraordinary soaring Gothic with things that we simply don't normally think about. If you've ever wondered about the strange structure of the abbey, the enormously extended point in the middle of the abbey, which is called the crossing, you have the transepts on either side, you've got the high altar, the screen, and then the nave. That extended space there is technically called a theatre. It's actually built for the coronation. It's designed specifically for the coronation. And then behind the great screen, which incidentally all the music for the coronations of the 20th centuries was specifically designed for the movement from the west doors through that screen and into the coronation theatre. That extraordinary building, that space, is designed for the coronation. Again, what we think of as the Great West Entrance is only put on in the beginning of the beginning of the 18th century, and the monarchs always used to enter the abbey through the Porta Regia, which is actually in the transept, in the north transept, which was directly adjacent to the old Palace of Westminster. But the centre of the church was, from the work of Henry III, was the enormous shrine, the tomb of Edward the Confessor, who is seen as the Norman kings are very keen to adopt him as a kind of benediction on the brutality of their usurpation. The way in which the Norman conquest is normally talked about in textbooks, it comes across rather as a slightly rough version of A Year in Provence. It's not. It is one of the most brutal acts of occupation in human history. The problems of the North stem directly from what William the Conqueror did. The North, the retardation of the North, is the direct result of the harrying of the North. The economy has never fully recovered from what William did. But anyway, to, as it were, heal over these terrible wounds, you adopt the last Anglo-Saxon king, you adopt Edward the Confessor as the founder saint, you construct this vast shrine, and you originally have vast tomb chests covered with, any of you who've been to Ravenna or any of you who've been to Monreale, they were covered in that extraordinary gold mosaic that you see there. The abbey must, before the Reformation, have been extraordinary. You have this great arc of gold of the tomb chests of the medieval kings. So it's a coronation church, it's a burial church, and it is right next to the great palace. There was only one place that was actually called a palace in the Middle Ages, and that's the Palace of Westminster. And of course, that bit hardly survives at all, save for because of the fire of 1834. We pass the Reform Act in 1832, and the thing burns down 2 years later. It's rather like the fate of the Blair government. You know, you do all of those things, and then there's a bonfire of the vanities. But the bit that survives is the noblest bit, which is the Great Hall, which, again, do you all remember it? It's on the same scale as a Victorian railway station. It is the largest medieval building north of the Alps. It is unbelievable. To begin with, it's not quite as impressive as it is now because it was aisled. They had no means of roofing over that vast space. But at the end of the 14th century, in the reign of Richard II, you get this wonderful carpenter, master carpenter, Henry Everley, who devises the hammer beam, which enables you to carry with an extraordinary, and remember, the Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages knocks classical architecture into a cocked hat in terms of engineering. These staggering engineering skills. So this vast space. What is it for? Well, it is for two things. It is the King's Hall, and behind it is the King's Palace, and it's where the kings are, because remember, government then, like government now, is an occasion. It happens from the autumn to the early summer, and then everybody goes away. It's just like now. And in that period of the usually beginning immediately after the Feast of All Saints, in other words, Halloween and whatever, the beginning of November is normally when the full court, the parliament and whatever meet. And so the king is resident there on and off for the winter months. But what else goes on there, particularly in the Great Hall and the rooms around it, is what again distinguishes England from virtually every other European country. It's there or in its vicinities that regularly meets the parliament. It's there that there is the exchequer. It's there that there are the law courts, the great common law courts. Still King's Bench, Queen's Bench. Though Common Pleas has disappeared, we still have the exchequer, whatever. This extraordinary continuity of our administrative history. So they're all there immediately dependent upon the king, drawing their power from the king, their symbol being the king, the royal arms, and everything else. And that's roughly the state of England in terms of its formal government. Everything within the precinct of Westminster, next to the great abbey, where the sanctification of the monarch takes place. All is there, all is concentrated in that space. It's completely different from what it appears now. Everything has got high walls around it. The abbey's got high walls, the palace has got high walls. All that comes down in the 18th and 19th century, and you lay it out in the fashions of Victorian and Edwardian town planning with your Parliament Square and open spaces and all the rest of it. So our government, and this again is one of the remarkable things about England, we have had a unified government for 1,000 years. This distinguishes us completely from effectively any substantial European state, whatever. So we've been with all the complaints about centralizing, well, so tough. We've been governed from Westminster since about 1100. That's what it is, right? It then changes, as virtually everything else in English history changes with the reign of the king that I have spent most of my life studying. That is to say, with Henry VIII. The reign of Henry VIII is the axial point. It's the turning point of English history. Now, Henry VIII is a very good king for an axis, that sense of girth and grease about him. Charles Dickens memorably calls Henry VIII a spot of blood and grease upon the history of England. So if you think of him as a well-greased axis around which everything turns, everything changes with the reign of Henry VIII. And it changes in a fashion we all have vaguely in our heads: the break with Rome, the Reformation, which is, of course, Brexit. Being very serious, it is the first Brexit. The issues are identical. You're rebelling against Rome, Reformation, rebelling against the Treaty of Rome, Brexit. Rome, the Roman Church, was a separate system of law, language, and office holding, exactly like the EU. And there were also special taxes. So it's, the pattern is astonishingly similar. And Henry, again on the back of the Reformation, Henry creates a passionate English nationalism. Henry is the first king to see England as a single strategic issue. Remember, we always go on about being an island. Being an island is no use unless you have a navy. Being an island with lots and lots of excellent natural harbours actually leaves you open to invasion. If you look in the Middle Ages, England is invaded every 5 minutes. Every change of dynasty, of which there are many in the Middle Ages, is a product of a European invasion. I mean, the Tudors, the dynasty that we think of, bizarrely, though they're Franco-Welsh, they're French and Welsh. We sort of imagine that they're English. The Tudors themselves are the direct, literal result of a French invasion. Henry's troops at Bosworth are French. The only person who gets a peerage out of Bosworth is a Frenchman. The money that fights at Bosworth is French, right? That's what it is. So you've got, that's before Henry. With Henry declaring himself the head of the English church, with England becoming what is different from Brexit, with England becoming the pariah of Europe, having to deal with the passionate resentment of the French and the Spanish and everybody else. You see England as potentially invadable. And unlike now, we were able to protect our frontier. It's quite astonishing. With none of the resources of the internet, the Tudors are actually able to protect the English frontier. You do it in two ways. You construct an astonishing, I'm talking about buildings a lot, you construct an astonishing string of fortifications, the whole of the way around England, starting in Newcastle. Newcastle is Henry's new castle. That's what it is. And the forts go the whole of the way down. They cluster particularly around where I live now, around Dover, Folkestone, and whatever, because that's where, as we now know, you are most prone to be invaded. And then they go all the way along the southern coast. They go along North Cornwall, those lovely castles there where now everybody surfs. They curve round past Bristol, again heavily fortified, and finish up at Milford Haven. It's one of the most extraordinary schemes of fortification in the world. It's done to Henry's personal direction, with people who go and survey the entire coastline, and we've got Henry's maps. Henry is a great cartographer. We have the actual maps. We can see him altering them. See him putting the details on there. So you conceive of England as a single strategic problem. You create, along with the stone walls that surround England, you create a wooden wall. The first serious navy is Henry. The core of naval organization is Henry. The origins of the naval board is Henry. But you also create a religious rhetoric, and a sort of religious come nationalistic rhetoric of England, again, so modern, England alone against the filthy Europeans. I remember vividly when I first went abroad, I was age 13, my mother was a northern working class Puritan. I had to explain to her that one of the places we were going to go to was Rome. The look of absolute horror in her face. And she couldn't quite convey what she really felt to me. I was, after all, a 13-year-old boy. I still remember the injunction, wash your hands. They have very funny toilet habits, you know. And the whole of that anti-Romanism, the whole of that sense of distance. Because remember, in the Middle Ages, we are always part of a cross-channel empire. This is the moment at which it breaks. But Henry breaks in another way. He doesn't simply break from continental Europe. Really, the first time you can think of England as separate from continental Europe is the early 16th century. I mean, if you think of medieval England up to that point, we're always part of an Angevin empire, Henry V's would-be empire. The great object of English policy is to conquer France, right? So the channel is not a barrier, it's a means of communication. It's with Henry that it becomes a barrier. But the other enormous change, and the change, so that's a change in our foreign policy. The change which comes about in our domestic policy is within Westminster. And within Westminster, the first great change is there's a huge fire. We know surprisingly little about it, but it burns down the whole of the Palace of Westminster, apart from the Great Hall and the complex of rooms around it. And from that point onwards, no king ever lives in the royal Palace of Westminster. Instead, the Palace of Westminster, although it's still called a palace, is still royal, is still vested in the Chamberlain and the Great Chamberlain, exactly as it is now, is occupied by what? It's occupied by Parliament, the law courts, and the Exchequer. Right? The king is never there except for the state opening of Parliament. That's the only time he's there. So where does the king live? Where does Henry live for the first nearly 20 years of the reign? The answer is that he commutes from Greenwich. Like many of us, you know, he can't be bothered with central London, so he goes off into a salubrious suburb, which is called Greenwich. He has a lovely new palace built by his father and his mother, which is not the modern Greenwich. The modern Greenwich is a creation of the 17th and the 18th century as the Royal Naval Hospital, but it's exactly the same site. And he can get to central London as fast as you can now. If you wait for the turning of the tide, you can be rowed up the river by your super strong rowers who can actually strong enough to there's the only bridge, there's London Bridge, and you've got to be very strong to get through there. But the river, what you do is, there's no point in, remember the Thames is completely tidal. At this point, there's no point in trying to row against the tide. You wait for the tide to turn, and then it sweeps you up, and you can be in Whitehall in less than half an hour. You try getting from Greenwich to Westminster by any means of transport, apart from a helicopter now, and you can't do it. It's only by the river. So the king uses that, and instead, his great minister, Cardinal Wolsey, takes the relatively modest town palace of the Archbishops of York and transforms it into this huge palace, which becomes colloquially known as the Palace of Whitehall. And when Wolsey falls, all his treasures are confiscated by the king, and by, of course, his point, I was going to say Carrie Boleyn, I meant Anne Boleyn, is very much on the scene, and she goes with Henry to inspect the loot of the fallen minister, which is displayed, you know, like trophies of Rome. All his vast treasures of tapestry, gold, silver, plate, whatever, are arrayed within the Palace of Whitehall for Henry to inspect and confiscate and seize. Because do we all remember why are we so well governed in the 16th century as opposed to the 21st? Because being in power had penalties. Now it only has rewards. In the 16th century, if you got it wrong, you were not made a European commissioner as you used to be, or you were not promoted to the House of Lords. If you were lucky, you had only your head cut off. If you were unlucky, I will not describe the process publicly. It's beyond decent of this. It's not what you can do in family viewing time, though I once organized a very good reproduction of it for Channel 4, but that's an entirely different matter. The makeup girl had, fortunately, a well-equipped boyfriend whose we could use take jelly castings of the relevant bits. But anyway, we really don't want to go there. But all your possessions were confiscated as well. That's why we were well governed. There were penalties for failure as well as rewards for success. And until we have those, we won't be, but that's another matter. So Wolsey falls, and what Henry does then is construct this new, vast palace. It stretches from the Ministry of Defence right across our modern Whitehall, which is then called King Street, with what was then the longest room in Europe. It was the 100-and-odd-yard long Privy Gallery, which stretched from the St. James's Park side of the palace, which I call the Royal Playpen. That was where all the sports were. It's where there was the jousting, it's where there was the tennis play, it was where there was the bear pit and the cockpit becomes the basis of the treasury. This seems to be very appropriate, you know. But anyway, the whole palace had this narrow, because not even Henry VIII could get rid of a right-of-way. There's a right-of-way that lies through the palace, and we've got these two complexes. Remember, the river runs north-south at this point. So the residential section is on the river side of the palace. The playpen side, the playpen aspect of the palace is on the St. James's side. And there are bridges, just like Venice, just like Florence, if you think. In Florence, again, there are the corridoio. There are the elevated corridors that link the various buildings. Again, there's an enormous one that runs from the Vatican to the Castello Sant'Angelo, so that popes can run away when things get rough, and they can hide in the security. You know, the Castello Sant'Angelo is Hadrian's tomb. You can actually hide behind those vast Roman walls. And Henry has, again, gateways at either end with corridors going over them. and the Privy Gallery, the key room of the palace, is carried over in the Holbein Gate, the famous gate with the busts of the Tudor monarchs on it. And it actually runs from the park side right over to the riverside, with at the end of the gallery, all these palaces, the access is from water. It's from the Thames. So you've got this landing stage that takes you to the Thames. And the Thames, remember, being completely different from what it is now. Why does the Thames freeze so much? It is not global warming, ladies and gentlemen. It is because it's shallow. It's because it's not embanked. It's twice the width that it is now. It's a sprawling, flowing stream. Most of the time, when the river is not at high tide, you've got swampy banks of dozens of yards on either side and a central stream in the middle. You get the idea. So every town palace has got a land. London is very, very difficult to believe. It's very like Venice. The principal mean of transport is water. And you have exactly as in Venice, you've got organized guilds of watermen that charge fixed prices. You've got wherries and you've got heavier boats and all the rest of it. So there we are. What does Henry do with this palace? Some of you may have studied history. You may even have done Tudor history. You may even be familiar. And let's just do a quick test. Does the name Geoffrey Elton mean anything to anybody? Ah, you see. Does the word Tudor Revolution mean anything to you? Poor old Geoffrey, my teacher, was under this bizarre notion that when Henry VIII ruled, there was a bureaucratic revolution which decided that monarchy was redundant and instead we were ruled by committee. I always asked Geoffrey, when was this fact explained to Henry VIII? And I think it's about 3 minutes before Thomas Cromwell is executed by a deliberately inexperienced executioner with a very rusty axe. It does take quite some time. Geoffrey's theory of a revolution in government, the idea of excluding the most powerful king. Henry VIII is the English Louis XIV, right? The most powerful king in English history, the most obviously monarchical. The idea you excluded him from power is preposterous. But Elton was right about one thing. What happens under Henry VIII, in this new palace of Whitehall, you develop new instruments of government. You develop, first of all, the office of Secretary of State, the one that Cromwell holds, except then it's just called Royal Secretary. And you develop the power of the council, the Privy Council, which becomes a formalized body. Neither the secretaryship nor the Privy Council are organized under Geoffrey and Hilary Mantel's favourite. By the way, Hilary Mantel is just Geoffrey Elton with adjectives. The entire account of Cromwell and Thomas More is derived directly from Geoffrey Elton. The fact that Cromwell is this reforming, modernizing, basically quite liberal hero, and Thomas More is this nasty, retarded, medieval Catholic. This is entirely the parody of the two of them that is produced by Geoffrey Elton. It's unfair to both of them. But anyway, that aside. So what you get then is the creation by Henry in the last 7 years of his reign of a conscious new royal centre of government in the Palace of Whitehall. The seat of the Privy Council is directly next to the King's bedchamber. The King's secretary, so the Secretary of State isn't the Secretary of State, he is the King's secretary. And his rooms are in the arch by which the gallery goes over King Street. So all of these people cluster directly around the King. The Privy Council cannot meet when the King is not in the same building. The King is never there, but it derives its powers directly from him. What does this mean? It means you've got two palaces with two different views of monarchy. In the Whitehall, you have the king, the actual living fleshly monarch, with these new instruments, the secretaryship and the council, which are designed to give direct, immediate executive power to the king himself, to respond immediately to the royal will. In the old palace of Westminster, these are also royal. I mean, still today in the House of Commons, even though the monarch cannot enter it, what appears over the throne of the Speaker? The royal arms. What appears over every judge's seat on which the monarch cannot sit, even though it's called Queen's Bench? The royal arms. But this is a different view of monarchy. In the Palace of Westminster, the monarch is not an individual. He or she, because it becomes she quite soon, is a representative of the normal way of doing business. It's a symbol of the community, whatever that means, governing itself. So do you see what I mean? You've now got two very different views of monarchy. You've got one which is collective, which is to do with English history and all the rest of it. And you've got another which is immediate, lively, personal. Obviously, the two are quite likely to conflict. And Henry again produces the grounds why they conflict. What I've talked about, religion. Clearly, when Henry makes himself supreme head of the church, it is can we all just get this right? We are familiar with the notion, or most of us are, that the Queen is supreme governor of the church. And in the days when she still toddled around, you saw her with a handbag walking a pace in front of the Archbishop of Canterbury. It all looks very gentlewomanly and genteel. Do you know what Henry VIII called himself? Supreme head on earth only under Christ. Right? That's what it meant. It was, in fact, a royal theocracy. It was a royal... He takes full papal powers. But, of course, that enormously expands royal power. From this point onwards, the king claims to rule over people's souls as well as their bodies. But at that point, they were very odd people, our ancestors, weren't they? They cared more about their souls than their bodies. So this becomes a matter of supreme conflict as Catholic fights Protestant, and as Protestants, above all, fight each other. And the monarch, particularly from Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, who is indeed Protestant, and of course is necessarily so in reaction to her sister Mary. Elizabeth is a deeply conservative and old-fashioned Protestant. I mean, Elizabeth, above all, is intelligent enough to know you couldn't have a genuinely Protestant monarchy because there's no ceremony. Protestants are really bad at ceremony, hopeless at ceremony. The Catholics are jolly good at it. And Elizabeth keeps virtually the whole repertory. And again, this was something I only discovered well into my career. All royal ceremony of the Middle Ages is religious. There is hardly any secular ceremony at all. The ceremonial year follows the church's year. The greatest moment of royal ceremony isn't a royal birthday or anything like that. It's the Feast of Epiphany, when the monarch plays the role of three wise men. And you've still got a vestige of it in the Chapel Royal at St. James's, when a gentleman usher on the Feast of the Epiphany of the 6th of January still offers up gold, frankincense, and myrrh on the chapel on the altar of St. James's, the tiny, well, quite small chapel that you have there. So the monarch then assumes, in the one hand, enormous power, but on the other hand, it is profoundly divisive. And Elizabeth, in taking over this highly ceremonialized religion, she loves music, she has a magnificent choir in her chapel royal. The problem is, all of the composers are Catholic. And England is rabid against Rome, you know, like my mother. So you have this, and it becomes, the only monarch who actually knows how to deal with it is James I. James I is the only monarch between Elizabeth and William III, who doesn't actually change religion. Otherwise, every monarch comes along and uses the royal supremacy to switch the style of religion. James has good sense to keep it as it was under Elizabeth. But then, of course, Charles comes along, his catastrophic son, with the appalling record of the House of Stuart. In many ways, I'd be quite pleased if the Scots went independent. I mean, we got rid of that catastrophic episode. And I'm being very serious. No, I'm very serious. The most disastrous period of relations in the bad relations between England and Scotland is when we share a common monarch but have separate parliaments in the 17th century. It is a period of absolute, repeated war of the most savage sort, in which, unfortunately, the Scots win. And that is a genuine desire. The hideous Puritan revolution in 17th century England is a result of the Scottish conquest, the conquest of Newcastle and whatever. Again, it's not normally presented like that, but that is actually what happens. So it becomes profoundly divisive. Charles I goes to an even more ceremonialized form of religion under the guidance of Archbishop Laud and so on. And that leads to, I think, it's this division over religion which brings the parliamentary structures of Westminster into the dramatic clash with the royal power of Whitehall that is backing that sort of new style religion, and that's what the Civil War is about. I mean, the notion that the Civil War is a class conflict, that it's driven by Marxism, is like everything else in Marxism, it's for the birds. It is simply not true. The people who fight on either side of the Civil War are of exactly the same social class origins, and the great leaders of the Civil War, to begin with, are, the ones opposing the king, are high nobles, including the ones that have been created by the Tudors. So you get then this clash in the 17th century between the two palaces, the two different views of kingship. Now, this is really important. Again, we know, or most of us know, that briefly England does become a republic. The French are always so late at these things. We execute a king in 1649. They have to wait until this is a very slow nation. And they have to wait till the 1790s. We put a king on trial. But it's astonishing public. We'd also done it before. We do it with Mary, Queen of Scots. It is, it's a completely revolutionary concept. Not that you bump a king off, everybody does that, but you actually subject them to a formal process of trial in the name of that other view of monarchy, that Westminster view of monarchy, that the king is about proper procedure, and what you say is the real King Charles II has betrayed the task of the ideal king, the crown. So Charles has betrayed the crown. Whitehall has betrayed Westminster, which is, of course, why Charles is executed in front of the Palace of Whitehall. It's why he's led to his execution through the throne room of the palace, which we call the banqueting house, absolutely deliberately, to humiliate him and to repudiate that vision of monarchy. Okay, we won't go into the detail, it's too complicated, but as you know, in the later 17th century, wisely, unlike the French, we decisively repudiate revolution, though what we did was more savage than the French. Significant parts of the French crown jewels, the main de justice of Charlemagne, the crown and whatever, survived the revolution because there was a sense of historicity, of history. The entire medieval English regalia is destroyed. There is not a single fragment that survives. The myth of the prince, the myth of the Black Princes, Ruby and the Stuart Emerald and whatever, are total myths. Everything of the coronation regalia is a late 17th century invention. It's a post-1660 invention. Everything, completely. Anyway, so we have a restoration, but there is this profoundly conflicted reign of Charles II. There is then the even more conflicted reign of James II when he tries to reimpose Catholicism on the country. And what happens? Well, there is another revolution, the revolution that really sticks, the Glorious Revolution, which establishes what we've all been taught to believe as this wonderful thing called the supremacy of Parliament. Now, there's a real problem with that. Parliament ain't supreme, but we'll investigate that in a moment. So you establish this thing called the supremacy of Parliament. Now again, let's just be amongst friends and honest. Parliaments cannot govern. The notion that Parliament is sovereign, the notion that Parliament is able to rule, was exposed magnificently when Bercow tried to make himself Oliver Cromwell. The notion that a representative assembly can rule is a total absurdity. It can't. What you've got to remember is that every European, there's nothing peculiar about the antiquity of the English Parliament. Every major European state has forms of representative estates, right? The peculiarity about England is that it survives. And the reason Parliament survives in England is exactly the opposite reason, for example, that was adduced by the Supreme Court in its preposterous ruling on the on Boris's prorogation, that the Parliament is there to hold the government to account. In other words, to make a nuisance of itself, to do a Burko. No, it's not. Parliament is created not by not by the reaction against weak monarchs. It's created by strong monarchs. It's created by Edward I and Edward III. Why? Because it's a convenient... The English discover this we're quite a polite people. So in the same way that in England, you sort of say sorry and please, and the French just say non. It was exactly the same way in which things were done with tax. In France, you were taxed at the point of a sword. Right? In England, you ask people. You get Parliament to agree. And you know what? Actually, people pay much more. And there was also the astonishing business, which was virtually unique to England, that our nobility and gentry actually paid tax. In France, paying tax was bad manners. It was only the lower classes. I'm being deadly serious. It's only the lower classes that pay tax. The entire aristocracy and nobility, and remember, the French aristocracy is gigantic. The English is 250. The French is 250,000. All the richest people in the country are exempt from tax. Any wonder France constantly goes bankrupt. It's why the English have got an empire and the French don't. Despite the fact, no, seriously, this is why England, remember, England is 8 million, France is 28. How does a state of 8 million defeat a state of 28? It is because you've got a completely different system of public finance. Right, okay. So, but the French had a parliament too, but it just gets in the way. So it's abolished. This is true of the representative assemblies all over Europe. Uniquely in England, Parliament makes itself useful and therefore indispensable. But there is a problem, as we saw with the Parliament of Burko and I hope he's not a friend of anybody, the dreadful Dominic Grieve and all the rest of it. Parliament needs managing. And the person who works out how to manage it, who is the key figure in our story, is the hero-villain of the 18th century. So what you've got with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, you have subordinated the monarchy, you have deprived the monarch, above all, of the capacity to change religion. Up to this point, England had followed the European monarch model that the religion of the people is the religion of the king. The English are unique in suddenly discovering, wouldn't it be much easier if the religion of the king is the religion of the people? That's what 1688-89 is all about. So you do that. But there is still the problem of how do you manage this newly empowered parliament? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is corruption. Robert Walpole does this. Robert Walpole invents the office of Prime Minister. And what is the office of Prime Minister? The office of Prime Minister exists to do two things. It exists to control the monarch on behalf of Parliament. So the office effectively the office of Prime Minister has vested in it all the actual royal prerogatives. Remember, we are not ruled by legislation, we are ruled by executive fiat. We are ruled in the name of the royal prerogative. But the whole of that prerogative is vested in the Prime Minister, with his absolute power and discretion. So what has happened is the royal prerogative is transferred to the Prime Minister, so that there is never any clash between what Parliament wants, in other words, what the majority in the Commons wants, and what the monarch wants, because finally the monarch has got to do what Parliament wants, right? So that's one half of the job of the Prime Minister. That's controlling the monarchy on behalf of Parliament. But the other job of the Prime Minister is to control Parliament on behalf of the monarch. And the way you do that is by using the huge resources of royal patronage to bribe, persuade, employ, divert, send off to empire the members of the ruling class who sit in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So you can manage Parliament. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is broadly how we are still governed. And the whole fuss that we've been seeing in recent weeks about, the role of corruption, second jobs, Geoffrey Cox and all the rest of it, is a direct replication of Robert Walpole and that regime. But it reminds us of several other things. It means we've got to understand the office of Prime Minister, not as it's presented in this childish account, the constitutional textbook account of British politics. The office of Prime Minister isn't the executive. It is the real monarchy. We've also got to remind ourselves that many countries have two monarchs, have had two monarchs. We have two monarchs. We have a symbolic... haven't we all noticed that who the Prime Minister is the most important factor in how we're governed, right? Much more important than which political party it is. It is the personality and the ambitions and drive and whatever of the person, or not, in the case of Theresa May. If you have a vacuum, you will all remember, I'm sure, the wicked Churchill on the subject of Clement Attlee, that an empty taxi pulled up in Downing Street and the Prime Minister got out. Well, that applies much more forcibly to Theresa May, doesn't it, really? Except I think it would be a very small car. It wouldn't even be a taxi and would probably break down. So it's a personality of the Prime Minister. So we've got to understand then we've got two monarchs, exactly as Japan did. Japan, until the Meiji Restoration of the 1860s, you had two monarchs. You had somebody who was very similar to the Queen, that is the Mikado, in a separate capital, Kyoto, and you then had the Shogun, who was the actual equivalent of Prime Minister, except that it was hereditary, in Tokyo, which is why you have the two railway lines connecting Kyoto and Tokyo. Again, you see, geography is so useful for understanding power, once you actually begin to think of these things seriously. Or similarly, in Merovingian France, you have the long-haired kings. It's a wonderful name, isn't it? A bit like Boris, really. But anyway, you have the long-haired kings who are carted around. They're sacred. They're dragged around in carts, and they appear to be drunk and drugged most of the time. And I'm not referring to Boris. And you've then got the mayors of the palace, who are the future Carolingians, people like Pepin and later on Charlemagne, who actually wield real power, and they eventually get rid of the Merovingians. We've done something different. We've done just exactly what the Japanese did, which is, again, one of the extraordinary similarities between British and Japanese history. We've kept these two things going. We've kept a monarchy that represents historical continuity and the formal way of doing things, but we also have this, and we have a genuine monarch with the powers of a monarch. And of course this means surrounded by a court. Downing Street is a court. It's a palace. There is a queen, there's a queen consort. The way, again, the people who govern us are not members of the cabinet. The cabinet is ciphers. It hardly meets. Do we all realize this? It barely meets. None of the decisions about COVID were taken in the cabinet. There are a handful of special advisors. There are people, we can talk about them more easily under Blair, people like Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson is an absolute courtier figure, a sort of trail of gilded slime behind him, the key figure in the court of Henry VIII, this inner court of Henry VIII, the equivalent, again, it's the Downing Street staff, the equivalent figure in the court of Henry VIII was called the groom of the stool. And he wiped the royal bottom, which seems to me to be a very precise analogy. He also handled the slush fund, he handled the mistresses, and he handled the secret stamp of the king's signature. It just sounds exactly combination of the roles of Mandelson and Campbell under Blair. And again, it accounts for the extraordinary role of somebody like Carrie Symonds. She manifestly is more important than any cabinet minister. Why are we having the extraordinary hoo-ha in Glasgow? Read anything Boris wrote before 2 years ago, and you will find he's a complete climate skeptic. But we need to understand this. And finally, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we need to realize that the notion that Parliament is sovereign is for the birds. It is merely a legal fiction. What Parliament is essentially, what the House of Commons is essentially, is an electoral college for the position of Prime Minister. That's what it is. But it acts as an emergency long stop. Whereas in America, the Electoral College, which is the thing that formally chooses the president, as you all realize this, don't you? The president is not chosen by the popular ballot. It's chosen by a weighted electoral college that is weighted towards the smaller states against the bigger states. That's what you have to do with a proper federal constitution. It's why we cannot have a federated British Isles, because here we've got this overwhelming size of England as against everybody else. It just does not work. But in England, but the moment the Electoral College has elected the president, it has never met since the Revolution. It has no real existence. Our parliament is different. It is an electoral college, but if things go badly wrong, as with Theresa May, it can, as it were, reconvene and remove. And again, the whole notion that we have this thing called the separation of powers is for the birds. Where is our government? It sits in the legislature. The executive controls the legislature. That's how parliament works. And finally, democracy. Oh dear. But you see, democracy is a deeply problematic form of government. The history of democracy and republics is a catastrophe. Only one republic has lasted longer than 5 minutes, and that's America. And they strove with every possible effort, despite all those declarations of universal freedom of all the rest of it, to make sure that the people enjoyed as little direct power as possible. And that's more or less the situation we have. But there's enough, we sort of have a role. And arguably we have more role than we should, because far too many modern governments simply exist as permanent election campaigns. You can only really understand the government, particularly of Tony Blair, as a permanent election campaign. So that, I'm afraid, may be a little too serious for the occasion, in which case I apologize. But I think we do need to start having, I'm on a campaign at the moment, that we need hard facts and reality. And we've existed in comfortable haze and blur and telling nice little stories to ourselves. I don't like nice little stories. I think we're adults, and I think we should contemplate it. And I'm delighted to be challenged and take questions that can be as abusive as you like. Thank you very much. Please, can you be very loud, because I will ooh.
Is President Xi of China, is he the way forward?
Now, this is very interesting. Is President Xi, now, is that how it's pronounced? I'm delighted to learn. I am delighted to learn. How do you pronounce X-I? Yes, right. Is President Xi the way forward? It could be. This is a terrible thought. What I said at the beginning of the COVID affair was get a Chinese virus and finish with the Chinese society. And we've seen serious moves in that direction. As my friend Jonathan Sumption has said repeatedly, lockdown is wholly illegal, antithetical to the traditions of common law, and has been passed with scant regard even to parliamentary procedure. Despite it, as well as its catastrophic economic, we now have a government debt that is on the same scale as the Second World War. It is deranged because it was a very minor virus. I mean, frankly, you compare with the Black Death, deaths of 25% in the first wave, eliminating half the population by the time it's finished. This is a blip. The damage of COVID was a self-inflicted damage, but that's a different matter. But it does raise these questions. And we have got, as always, I am a historian, I'm not a prophet. The great test with China is very simple. What China has taught us, what China since Deng has taught us, is that the whole notion that we had that lies at the basis of Western policy, is anybody familiar with the work of Francis Fukuyama? Nobody has ever been more appropriately named. The essay on the end of history, arguing that there was after the fall of the Berlin Wall and Russia, the communist Russia, there was an inevitable triumph of liberal democracy and liberal capitalism. What we have discovered with Deng's China is you can have an unbelievably productive economy without any political freedom. That is a terrifying thought, because the only thing we have is freedom. The reason that we created, remember, modernity is invented in England. Quite simple. England from Newton onwards. Modernity is invented here. In the same way, the British Empire is the beginnings of globalization. These things are just facts. This is not empty boasting or whatever. It is a simple fact. Voltaire was one of the very few Frenchmen to have lived in England and actually understood England, acknowledges the fact straight off. So there is that. But it was based on an idea of freedom, that there is a relationship between a free society and a functioning market economy. China showed that's not true. The enormous question and the terrifying question is, can China innovate without freedom? If you actually look at the history of China, did anybody see the first Emperor exhibition in the British Museum? For me, it was one of the great experiences. I went around with Jeremy Paxman. Dear me, that was extraordinary. The language I cannot repeat, but never mind. But what was striking about the first Emperor exhibition was there was this wonderful, the first Emperor's chariot, we're about 800. The first Emperor's chariot is more sophisticated in its springing than anything that Western Europe can produce before the Phaeton of the Regency period of the early 19th century. But China just keeps on making that until 1940. In the same way that ancient Egypt, with this astonishing level of technological sophistication, just keeps on with it. We are the first civilization to have incrementally changed, to have constantly innovated, right? The question is going to be, can China innovate without freedom? If China can innovate without freedom, we're finished. Simple as that. Next question. Oh, we've got a microphone. Yes, that would be great. Would somebody pass it on? Yeah. That's true. Thank you very much, Josh. That's very kind.
How do you see the end for Queen Carrie Boleyn?
How do I
see the end for Queen Carrie?
How do I see the end of Queen Carrie? How would I like to see the end of Queen Carrie? I think the precedent of Anne Boleyn should be followed absolutely. But and bearing in mind how Boris has treated previous wives and mistresses, it would not surprise me. She's doing something profoundly dangerous, which is visibly to interfere in politics. As a totally non-elected figure. And even people like Sherry Blair, Sherry Booth, were not as blatant as she is. And the English do not like it. Anne Boleyn was hated. Margaret of Anjou was hated. Some of the queens of the Stuarts, Henrietta Maria was hated because they did that. And it's a profoundly dangerous thing. But you see, it is because Downing Street is a court. Sorry, that's what it is. And in a court, inevitably, the woman, especially when it's the younger, attractive, highly fertile, carefully producing lots of... No. The power of a woman to produce children and to trap a man has been deployed with immense kind of logical skill. Come on, every man here knows what's going on. It is the forceps on the chap, isn't it? I mean, that's what it is. And please tell me if I'm wrong. But I mean, it does seem to me to be visibly the case. But it's because it's a court. I mean, if it were a properly run government like Thatcher, look at the invisibility of Dennis. He may have, the parody of him is just sort of quaffing, very strong gins. Well, there was a measure of truth. The gins were very strong indeed, not quite as strong as her whiskies. But equally, he deliberately does not play any public role. She does, and there will be a price. And either he will pay it or she will pay it, or more likely they both will. Next question. Please, yeah.
If Henry and Boris took us out of Europe, who's going to take us back in to continue?
Can you just repeat that a little more clearly? If Henry and Boris...
If Henry and Boris took us out of Europe, who takes us back in to continue the trend of somebody else?
Oh, if Henry and Boris take us out of Europe, who will take us back in? Again, I'm not a prophet. And I do think that I find myself observing what happened in the referendum with enormous interest. I'll again be quite honest, I voted out. I think that the structures of the EU are French Napoleonic. They're hostile to English common law. They also privileged a Franco-German hegemony, which was profoundly injurious to British interests. That's another matter. But where I was surprised was I thought that the habits of the EU, I thought the fact that the whole of, if you like, the professional class, the whole expert class came down in favour of remaining within the EU would carry the day. But then, of course, I was a fool, wasn't I? Because I know, as a historian, that the English, unlike the Scots put up with a Presbyterian presbytery, which is why they put up with the dreadful woman who's running the place now. Can you imagine England having a politician like her? He would not be tolerated for 1 second. That awful whining hectoring. But if you had Presbyterian ministers, remember Scotland? I mean, Scotland, as late as 1690, a boy is hanged for denying the existence of the devil. It's a priest-ridden society, which is why they pay so much attention to the professions. The professions are the direct inheritors of the power of priests. When the Scots, having conquered England at Newcastle in the First Civil War, tried to force the English Parliament to impose a Presbyterian system on England, the English Parliament does it nominally, but the Scottish representative, Leslie, in London, comes up with this wonderful phrase, the English have only got a lame Erastian presbytery. That means the state still controls the church. The English gentry weren't going to be told what to do by some scrofulous, jumped-up little priest who'd been to Oxbridge. You know. They were gentlemen. They were going to be dictated to by some spectacle-wearing little nerd. The proper behaviour of the public schools sorted this kind of thing out in seconds. And it's a very, very different set of attitudes. It's a very, very different set. I'm expressing it humorously, but I'm trying to get at real fundamental points. And an enormous part of the reaction against the reason for the outvote was, first, the rootedness of our history. The sense from Henry VIII onwards that we're different from Europe. But the Channel, as I would argue, is the widest strip of water in the world. What is meant by the public interest changes on either side of the Channel. The French notion of the public... Why can the French build a railway in 5 seconds? Because the French notion of the public interest is something that's discerned by Monsieur le Ministre. It's a top-down. France is an entirely deductive culture. We are an inductive culture. The public interest... How do you establish the public interest in England? Many of you will know. You have a public inquiry and everybody argues with each other. And then you don't take a decision. And if you do, as with HS2, everybody whinges and wails for the next 20 years, which is why we're a free country, but we're very bad at building railways. So there are these kind of profound differences which are at work. There's also, of course, that the vote in... So it was a vote for Henry VIII. I expected to waken up at the night of the referendum result, recognizing that the king that... I don't idolize Henry as a monster, but the king in whose reign I'd fundamentally still lived, that the reign was finally over. I wakened up that morning to realize Henry VIII was still on the throne. And the fundamental changes that he brought about were still there. But it's something else. It's the rebellion of the tradesman against the professional. It's the rebellion of the chaps who do things, mainly men, against the women who tell them what to do. It's a sex. This is what so much of... Sorry, again, we must call things by their proper names. And what has happened is, this is what the whole business of levelling up, it's what the shift in the vote of the North is about. It is the reaction against the bossiness of the professional classes. Because remember, you have teachers now who think they know what should be taught, not the teachers. You have policemen who decide what is an offence and not the law. You have midwives who are so keen to impose natural childbirth that they kill babies. And so there is this rebellion against a professional dictatorial elite. And these are all bound up in that process. So I think the person who took us back into the common market or the EU would be very foolish and would not last very long. And I can see no circumstances. I can see very few circumstances, unless there is actual economic collapse, which I don't believe. And the only reason there would be that would be climate scare. Any more? Yes, I think we've got to have a lady after the rude things that I've said. So here is your opportunity for revenge. Yes.
Going back to the Middle Ages.
Will you speak into the microphone? Thank you.
Going back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
My understanding is that medieval monarchs could only impose a new tax with the permission of Parliament.
Yes, that's right.
Is that right? So how did that come about, and is that different to the situation in Europe?
Yeah, completely. Taxing. This is why the French are completely happy to get rid of the Estates General and continue imposing tax, because the political elite don't pay taxes. It's only in France, the absolute rule until the revolution is only those who can't pay tax. And there's something, again, we've got to understand this. There is something deeply peculiar about the English governing class, that they're willing to pay tax. And it's one of the reasons why they think they've got the right to control government, because they pay for it. But it really is important we understand this. The power to raise tax, the power of Parliament to agree to taxation, is specifically given to it, partly by Edward I, but especially by Edward III, to fight his great wars against France. What we have to understand is that, again, we teach history so badly. England is a violent, expansionist, hugely successful military power. And as with Rome, there is a direct relationship between freedom at home and aggressive conquering expansion abroad. This is as true in the Middle Ages. How do the English, again, manage to fight as this tiny country? How do you largely conquer France? Well, there are two reasons. You've got a much more effective system of state finance and much more effective taxation. But the bulk of the taxation that pays for the 100 Years' War is exactly the same as the Arab countries of the 1970s. You basically impose a hugely high export duty on wool, which is effectively a monopoly product. So the people who pay for the war are the poor buggers in continental Europe who are being duffed up by the English. And remember, the figures are astonishing. The customs duty on wool is 1/3 ad valorem. Now, that's a level of modern taxation, and they're able to get away with it. But the reason kings do it is because it enables them to do what they want. In the same way, Henry VIII gives Parliament, or uses Parliament, to break with Rome. So he effectively gives, in that sense, gives Parliament not only control over taxation, but control over religion. But he's leading it. He's shaping it. Are you following me? In exactly the same way that Edward III was leading, shaping the war effort. And the problem, of course, becomes when those powerful, visionary kings are succeeded by fools and weaklings, and Scots. The Stuarts are utterly desirable. I mean, really, one just has to face it. I suspect, with rather good luck. I mean, I can imagine nothing worse than the monarchy that would have emerged in England if Edward VI had lived. We'd have been like Sweden at its worst. You'd have been this radical Protestant state. Edward again is a convinced radical Protestant. You would have had no music. You'd have completely destroyed the tradition of church music. You would have stripped out every single surviving image of the Middle Ages. We would have nothing. On the contrary, we'd be very good at Latin. No, there would be compensations. And and I think you would have actually had imperial expansion much earlier. Edward saw himself as a future warrior prince. So, but what happens is, of course, a completely different story. Henry is succeeded by a minor, by Mary, who... Mary was actually, in many ways, an exceedingly good monarch. She had a single failure. She failed to produce a child. If Mary had produced a child, there wouldn't have been a Reformation. We'd have become part of the Habsburg Empire. All things hang upon threads. There are these big patterns that I've been drawing. But there's also the absolute importance of the specificity, the moment, the accident. English history turns at the moment in the summer of 1555 that Mary realizes, and well, Mary doesn't realize, but everybody else realizes that Mary isn't going to have a child. And the rumors circulate in London that after having allegedly been about to give birth since Easter, by the time it's the middle of August, something's gone wrong. And there are the rumors that she's been delivered of a French lapdog or a monkey. And the entire humiliation of the monarchy. But it hangs on that sort of thread. That sort of thread. This will have to be the last question. Yes. Oh, well, actually, you got your hand up first. Can you wait for the microphone?
Well, couldn't you argue that the power of Parliament stems from the fact that Henry VIII used all the money that was available and every king after him was broke?
That Henry, I didn't quite catch it.
Effectively used all the money. Every king that came after Henry was broke.
Was broke. Well,
yes.
They were well, again, we've got to be careful here. The tax, what Henry does, Cromwell's original intention when there was the confiscation of the monasteries was that you were going to endow the monarchy with a vast landed estate that would actually make Parliament redundant. Geoffrey Elton doesn't realise this. That was Cromwell's original intention. It was to make Parliament redundant by endowing the monarchy, which he would have done. This, if you kept the monasteries, whatever it is, a quarter of the wealth of England, you would have a monarchy endowed with that. But Henry blows it because he wants a nice war against France. And so you blow the lot. And from that point onwards, you have no monarch who establishes a national purpose. If you look at Edward III, he establishes a national purpose, which is defeating France. And he persuades Parliament of the fact. From that point onwards, Elizabeth might have had if she'd been prepared to mount a Protestant crusade, but she won't. And the result is the tax base erodes steadily until William III. From the moment of William III in the Glorious Revolution, from 1689, what happens is immediately there is a total transformation of the English system of public finance. Parliament votes substantial revenues. The English are able to borrow at 3 to 5% at a time when France is borrowing it up to 20%. And the result is that England defeats France at Blenheim in 1705 and is then able to mount this astonishing series of victories right through the 18th century. The First World War, as Churchill says, is the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. That's the war in which France loses India and Canada. And if you go into the Guildhall of the City of London, you will see what it's all about. William Pitt is there, William Pitt the Elder, and it's about the relationship between the city and war. 18th century England discovers how to wage war at a profit. This is the key to the 18th century. This is why England dominates the world, because of this astonishing financial machine. On the one hand, the fact you can borrow these tiny rates of interest, because England has never gone bust since 1689. Every other European country has done so several times. The French ruined themselves trying to defeat England after the War of 1760, the 7 Years' War. That's why the French intervene on behalf of the American revolutionaries. And it's a delight to acknowledge that's why they have a revolution. They bankrupt themselves supporting the Americans. And you had the idiot Marie Antoinette wandering through Versailles saying, "Où sont mes chers républicains?" And she found when they... So, I'm sorry, the bankruptcy of the English monarchy is the 17th century. English public finances from 1689 are unique in Europe in their profitability and in their sustainability and the lowness of interest rates and the absolute solidity of all the things we talk about, consuls and all the rest of them. You know, why London turns into the world financial centre. All sustained by this structure of a parliament and monarch bound together by the position of premier. Why are you smiling? I mean, sorry, that is what happened. Oh, no, sorry, but isn't it? Yeah, good. No, but sorry, it really is just, we've got, again, I've been, I hope occasionally light and funny and whatever, but I'm being deadly serious in this. We have got an appalling record in teaching and understanding our history. Appalling. It is either rejected and mocked or it's sentimentalized. Neither is appropriate for adults. I've been trying to talk this evening as though we're all adult. And if we, again, it's not simply, you know, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, but there is an element of that. We need to understand, and we also need to understand that despite the fact that what I've been describing is not remotely moral or virtuous, and notions of morality and virtue barely enter into it, but heavens, does it work? Human beings, we're not perfect animals. We're rough and ready, and we're driven by lust, and we're driven by greed, and we're driven by envy, and occasionally virtue, and exactly what's going on this evening. We're a mixed bag. We've got a system which is a pretty well perfectly functioning mixed bag. Thank you very much.